Mr. Kuleba, earlier this week we marked 1,000 days since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of your country. Few of us could have imagined that it would be still going now. We're coming up on 3 years. What's your assessment of where things stand in this war right now?
Well, first and foremost, for the first time in our history, Ukraine saved its statehood from the attack coming from Moscow. And this is a big deal. But the war rages on, and today Russia continues to advance on the battlefield. This is the reality that we have to recognize. And we have to step up our domestic efforts and also, together with partners, increase the support in order to first stop Russia, to put Ukraine in a better position, to end this war on just terms. This, I think, will be the task for 2025.
Do you see the Ukrainians posing any real challenge to Russia if we're still in this position a year from now? As you said, the Russians are gaining momentum.
The existence of the state of Ukraine is the biggest challenge to Russia, and we have to understand that. The front line moves, lives are being lost, missile attacks on our energy infrastructure and cities take away civilian lives. This is all the reality of the war. But as long as Ukraine fights, it has the chance of winning the war and making Putin accept Ukraine as independent democracy and part of the West.
On the issue of Vladimir Putin himself, this is a man well known for wanting a mass Russian territory and what he believes to be historically parts of Russia to be returned to it. Do you think there's going to be any stopping him in this objective of conquering Ukraine and other areas which he feels are rightly his? I mean, right now we're talking about the full-scale invasion, but I don't need to tell you, we've been talking about the annexation of Crimea for years and years now. What will it take for Putin himself as an individual to stop this mission?
Well, let's not underestimate his ambition. His real goal is to crush the West. This is what he opposes, the West and what it stands for. So what he tries to achieve in Ukraine is first, of course, to dismantle our statehood, to think that every Russian ruler over the last 3 centuries hated the most. And second, he wants to gain a clear manifestation that the West is incapable of defending what it stands for and what it preaches for globally. Because if he succeeds, it will have a domino effect on in other parts of the world, and you will see other conflicts and wars breaking out, because everyone will see that the West cannot help its allies and friends.
Well, on that point, sir, let me ask you about that, because in the West, there is this ongoing fear, and it's been there for so many years, that the governments in Washington, in Ottawa, in London do not want to aggravate Putin because we don't know how he might retaliate. So has that fear that's been embedded since the Cold War resulted in hampering your ability and your country's ability to defend itself?
Well, there is very little I can add to your assessment, except that I also have to recognize that in its 33 years of independence, Ukraine should have been more careful with keeping its army and modernizing its army and preparing it for potential conflict with Russia. What we did recently by reviving our defense industry is miraculous, but this is the correction of the mistake that we were making. But yes, you are right. Unfortunately, I see that the West is still driven by the fear of Putin's escalation. And that gives Putin advantage because he does not need any reasons to escalate. He escalates because he knows the goal that he is pursuing, and the West still has to decide what it wants to do with Russia and how.
Mr. Kuleba, let me ask you about some of the changes that have taken place just this week with the Biden administration. They've permitted now American-made long-range ballistic missiles to be used on Russian territory, to be deployed by Ukraine. And just yesterday, we learned that the Biden administration is approving sending over anti-personnel mines to Ukraine. And this is a first for the Americans since the UN resolution against the use of landmines. Is it all too little too late, sir?
Well, perhaps saying two would be too much. But the truth is that, yes, some of the decisions should have been taken earlier. And it would have allowed us to avoid the situation where we currently are. Having said this, I think that these decisions are still valid, they still make sense, and they strengthen Ukraine's combat capabilities, which will help us to slow down Russian advancement and as the ultimate goal, to stop their advancement in Ukraine.
We know that a new administration is coming to power in the United States come January. Donald Trump and many of his closest advisors have made no secret that they are not necessarily in favor of supporting Ukraine in this ongoing war. And at the same time, Ukraine's ambitions to join NATO still persist. So does NATO itself need to become more Eurocentric, and therefore Ukraine has different allies it can turn to for support in the ongoing war?
Well, I would say Europe has to become more Eurocentric. And the second presidency of Donald Trump is the opportunity for our European friends to take the security risks they are facing more seriously, and to realize that the US umbrella is not here forever. So, without the United States, Europe currently finds it very difficult to defend itself. But it has to improve on its record in defense, in producing weapons, in building up its defense, and eventually count on its own. If that recognition comes to the minds of the decision makers and stakeholders in Europe, that will also help Ukraine to be better prepared, better equipped to repel Russian invasion with the support of its European partners.
Mr. Kuleba, when you were in the position of the Foreign Affairs Minister, having these incredibly important strategic meetings with other members of the government, with your president, at a time where your country has been invaded, I mean, few of us will ever know the kind of pressure and challenges that come with being in a position like that. Can you take us behind those closed doors in any sort of way without compromising anything, but give us a sense of what those conversations are like? How does the government and the military in tandem decide where to deploy troops? What's the best strategy? Who to turn to?
Well, first, when the war breaks out, the thing you have to do is to make a choice, whether you're fighting or not. If you're fighting, the first thing you have to do, you have to burn bridges and to realize that you put all your stakes on winning the war. Dwight Eisenhower, the US president and the commander of the armed forces in Europe during the Second World War, once said that pessimists never won a war. And so while burning your bridges, you still have to remain optimists that you can win, because if you fall into pessimism, you're not going to do that. And then the rest comes from this assumption, from this conviction, I would say. So you sit down and you calculate the resources available to you, you calculate what partners can help you with, and then you make all the decisions because you have a clear goal. You have to survive, you have to protect your statehood, while knowing that the enemy accepts no compromises and its ultimate goal is to destroy you. And this will be the main difficulty for, I believe, Trump administration and other leaders in Europe. They have to understand one thing. Putin is not looking for compromises. He may only accept tactical decisions, tactical concessions, but his ultimate goal will remain the same: crush Ukrainian statehood and crush the West as a global force.
Sir, the extent of our conversation has been about your role and your expertise as someone who's been in a very high-profile position in Ukraine. But I'll ask you now, as an ordinary citizen of Ukraine, many of your countrymen are feeling exhausted by this war, and some, if I may say, are beginning to lose hope as we're inching towards year 3 of the war. If you were speaking to them now, what would you tell them?
Well, that's, of course, a very difficult question, but imagine that you have a 40 million nation dispersed all across the world. And it doesn't matter where you are, but you are you share the same trauma, the trauma of this war, of separation, of losing the ground, losing the beloved ones. And you will live with this trauma, you will pass it on to the next generation. But then you have a choice. You can give up because you're exhausted, you're too tired, and then see your country vanish from the map and enormous atrocities committed against women, children, and men in Ukraine by the occupation forces, or keep fighting. This is the reality that we are facing. So my message would be very simple. We have to keep fighting for Ukraine by all means available to us, because dropping the fight or giving up would lead to consequences of unimaginable sorrow and would be a real tragedy for each and every one of us. We know our history too well, we learned lessons, and for the sake of the future generations, we have to defend ourselves.
Dmytro Kuleba, a real honor to have you on the show, sir. Please do come back and chat with us again. Thank you.